I woke up to the sound of her heels on the hardwood floor, clicking down the hallway like a timer I'd forgotten to turn off. It was barely past 6, and the sun hadn't decided if it would come out or not. My joints had their answer already. The stiffness in my knees whispered that it was going to be a long day, the kind that starts before the body says yes. I sat up slowly, pressing my palm into the mattress for leverage. My room, the guest room, she called it, was small and square, wedged between the laundry closet and the back stairs, but it was quiet, and the only corner in her house that still belonged to silence. "Grandma?" Joshua's voice floated up the stairs. "Mom says you have to take us to school. She's running late again." She was always running late. That wasn't news. And it was always me who got slotted into the holes she didn't have time to fill. I had long stopped expecting gratitude for it. Some mornings I told myself I liked the routine, making breakfast, packing their bags, tying shoelaces, kissing foreheads. It reminded me I still mattered. I pulled on the cardigan I kept on the chair. It was one of the few things I brought from Howard's house, the old place that smelled like cedar and quiet winters. He'd been gone 3 years now. Heart stopped suddenly, as if the world had asked too much of it. After the funeral, Vanessa had offered me this room. "You shouldn't live alone at your age," she'd said. "It's not safe." It sounded like concern, but when she handed me the real estate listings, I understood it was an arrangement. I sold Howard's house and gave her the down payment for her new place. She called it an investment in the family. I called it dissolving, the last piece of ground I stood on. Downstairs, Lily and Joshua were eating cereal in silence. Their eyes didn't lift from their tablets. The milk in their bowls had long turned warm. I kissed them each on the head, a habit from when they were toddlers and still reached for me without prompting. "Where's your mom?" "In her room," Lily said, mouth full, yelling on the phone. That was the soundtrack of this house, Vanessa's voice, slicing through rooms, correcting someone, accusing someone, winning something. She was always dressed like a magazine cover, hair perfect, heels unforgiving, lips tight with effort. There was no softness to her anymore. Somewhere along the climb, she'd stripped it away. When she finally came into the kitchen, she didn't look at me, just checked her phone and said, "Mom, take them. I've got 35 minutes to fix a disaster." I nodded. "Of course." She paused, still tapping. Can we not do the health complaints today? Every day it's something new. Your back, your knees, your heart, maybe just push through it." "I'm not complaining," I said quietly. "I just didn't sleep well." "Neither did I," she snapped, "but I don't mention it." The kids were already putting on their shoes. Vanessa walked past me, smelled faintly of perfume and cold steel. I didn't say anything else. There was no use. That evening, I started coughing, halfway through folding the laundry. A dull ache was spreading from behind my eyes, and my limbs felt submerged in water. When she came home at 8, the children told her I'd been acting strange. She opened my door, barely stepping inside. "You're sick?" "I think so," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. She folded her arms. "You should go somewhere else until you're better. Joshua's asthmatic. I can't risk it." "Where would I go?" "I don't know," she shrugged. "A motel? A shelter? Just for a few days." I looked at her, trying to find the girl I had once braided hair for, the teenager I stayed up with during flu season. But she wasn't there. Only a woman with perfect eyeliner, saying my presence was too dangerous to be tolerated. "I don't have money for that," I said. She tossed a few bills on the bed. $7. Enough for a bus to the center. They'll take you in. That night, I packed my life into one worn suitcase. She told me not to take anything they'd bought. "Just your things," she said. I took 2 sweaters, Howard's picture, and a pair of shoes that pinched my feet. Lily and Joshua watched from their doorways. I wasn't allowed to hug them. "Grandma's just going somewhere to get better," Vanessa told them, her voice syrupy and brittle. "She'll be back soon." They didn't believe her. Children sense when something is breaking for good. As I stepped out into the cold, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because there's a kind of hurt that goes too deep for tears. The kind you don't explain, the kind you carry. And that night, I carried it all. In my knees, in my suitcase, and in the pocket of my coat. $7, the last receipt of a motherhood unpaid. The supermarket parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in. The engine hummed softly under my hands, but I left it running for a while, afraid that turning it off would mean accepting what was next. I sat there, both palms on the wheel, watching the store lights flicker through the windshield. The heater made a low clicking sound, like something struggling to stay alive. I knew I couldn't sleep in the car. Vanessa had been clear about that. "Leave it in the lot," she said, as if I were returning a rental. I turned off the ignition and stepped out into the cold. The night had a wind to it, not cruel but detached, like a stranger passing you on the street without eye contact. My suitcase clattered against the pavement as I dragged it toward the sidewalk. It didn't roll straight anymore. One of the wheels had cracked long ago. I'd meant to fix it, but somehow, like everything else that had only to do with me, it never made the list. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even have a place to sit until the shelter opened. The bench by the bus stop offered me its splintered kindness. I lowered myself onto it, the metal cold against my spine, and pulled the coat tighter. My breath came out in clouds, dissolving before they reached the streetlight. I was trying not to shiver, not because of pride, but because I feared if I started, I wouldn't stop. I opened my wallet. Inside, a few coins, a crumpled receipt from the pharmacy, and the folded bills she'd thrown on the bed. 3 singles, 2 coins, $7. The sum total of what my daughter thought I was worth, after raising her, nursing her through fevers, giving her the very house she now lived in. $7 to disappear. I found myself laughing softly, not bitter, not angry, just surprised by how absurd life could be. At 62, I was homeless, sick, and alone. My whole existence reduced to a suitcase and a number less than the price of a weekday lunch. It felt like someone else's story, the kind people whispered about with judgment in their tone. But now, I was the whisper. Across the street, a small cafe still had its lights on. The sign above the door read, "Nora's." The letters were hand-painted, slightly crooked, but warm in their imperfection. I stood, my legs heavy beneath me, and crossed slowly toward it. Inside, there were only 2 tables occupied. The windows were fogged from the heat, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee wrapped around me as I opened the door. A woman behind the counter looked up, mid-50s maybe, with copper-red hair tucked into a loose bun and reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Her name tag read Nora. She smiled, not the kind of smile that asks questions, but the kind that offers space. "Cold night," she said, reaching for a kettle. "I was hoping for a cup of tea," I answered. My voice cracked on the last word. She nodded and gestured to a seat at the counter. "Sit, I'll bring you the hottest I've got." I set my suitcase beside me, careful not to let it tip. My fingers were stiff, and I rubbed them slowly, trying to coax them back into usefulness. When she placed the mug in front of me, the steam curled toward my face like a memory of warmth. "Rough night?" she asked, but her tone was soft, not probing. I nodded. More like a rough life, condensed into one evening. She didn't ask for details, just poured more water into the kettle and wiped down the counter with steady hands. That silence, that kindness, felt like more than anything Vanessa had offered in years. My eyes fell on a small stand near the register. Lottery tickets. Howard used to say those were for people who didn't understand math. You're more likely to be hit by lightning, he'd joke, while holding a winning ticket in a tornado. But tonight, I wasn't holding out for logic. Logic had led me here, with nothing but $7 and a story no one cared to hear. I slid $2 across the counter. 1 ticket, please. Nora looked at me, surprised. Feeling lucky? No, I said, but I've run out of other ideas. She handed me a ticket and the change, $2.50. I placed the ticket in my coat pocket without looking at it. The tea cost the same as the ticket. Now I had less than half of what I'd started with and still no place to sleep. But I had something else, a chair, a cup of tea, a stranger who didn't flinch when I said nothing. That night, I didn't ask for help. I simply existed in a warm place with someone who didn't require me to earn my right to sit. That felt like a beginning, even if I couldn't name what it was beginning toward. Nora closed the cafe at 10, but she didn't rush me out. Instead, she brought a second cup of tea, chamomile this time, and set it down without a word. I was the last customer, the one who hadn't ordered dinner, hadn't said much, hadn't even looked up from her hands. She didn't seem to mind. There was something old-fashioned in her stillness. It reminded me of the church ladies from my childhood, quiet women with tired feet who knew that kindness didn't need to announce itself. When she asked, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" It didn't sound like judgment. It sounded like someone who'd once had to ask the same question of herself. I hesitated. "Not really." She nodded, like that confirmed what she'd already guessed. "There's a spare room upstairs. It's not much. Used to be my daughter's before she moved out. It's clean, warm, and no one has to know." I looked at her then. Really looked. Her eyes were brown, clear, steady. She wasn't pitying me. She was offering something quieter, respect. The kind you don't expect after someone's handed you $7 and a locked door. "Why?" I asked. It came out smaller than I meant it to. Nora shrugged. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing. Because I remember what it's like to have a suitcase and no place to put it. And because you remind me of my mother. And she'd haunt me if I left you out there tonight." I smiled for the first time that day. It caught me off guard, how unfamiliar it felt to use those muscles. "I'll help out," I said quickly. "I'm a good cook. I don't want charity." "We'll figure it out in the morning," she replied. "Right now, you need rest." She closed the register, flipped the lights, and led me through a narrow stairwell in the back. The apartment above the cafe was modest, but it smelled of lemons and clean cotton. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a worn sofa, and a shelf of dusty books. She opened the smaller door and gestured inside. "This one's yours." There was a twin bed, a small desk, and a dresser with mismatched knobs. A window overlooked the alley where the streetlight pooled into a soft golden shape. I set my suitcase down gently, as if afraid it might wake me from something. "I'll make you something for the cold," she said, disappearing into the kitchen. I sat on the bed, hands on my lap, the quiet settling around me like a blanket I hadn't felt in years. My body still ached, and my head throbbed just beneath the eyes, but for the first time that day, I wasn't bracing myself against the next dismissal. I pulled Howard's picture from my suitcase. His smile hadn't changed, though I'd aged miles since the last time I'd held it. I whispered, "She called me a burden, your princess. I wish you could have seen it." A knock on the door. Nora came in, holding a tray with tea and 2 small sandwiches. "Chamomile, honey. A little ginger," she said, handing me the cup. My grandmother swore it cured everything but a broken heart. Is there a cure for that? I asked. She smiled. Time and new people. I nodded and sipped the tea. It burned slightly on the way down. That felt right. We didn't speak again. She closed the door softly behind her, and I was alone. I changed into the nightgown I kept folded between sweaters, one of the last things that still smelled faintly of home. I lay down without turning off the light. On the nightstand, I placed the tea, the sandwich I couldn't finish, and the folded lottery ticket I'd almost forgotten I'd bought. I didn't check it. I didn't need another no tonight. I just needed sleep. Tomorrow would be for disappointments, or maybe, for the first time in a long while, for something else. The morning air in the little upstairs bedroom felt gentler than it had the night before. The radiator clinked and sighed, tired but trying. Much like I was, I opened my eyes slowly, not jolted by any alarm, not summoned by voices or slammed doors. The light was soft, filtered through linen curtains, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I remembered. I was in the room above Nora's cafe, and no one was asking me for anything. The clock on the dresser read 8. I had not slept that late in years. I sat up, let my feet touch the floor, and stayed there a moment. My body still ached, but it was different now, like something was loosening, some part of me I'd clenched too long. The world outside the window moved on without me, and that, strangely, was a comfort. I stood and walked over to the mirror. It was mounted above the dresser, slightly tilted. The face that looked back at me was older than I remembered, but I studied it without flinching. Gray roots had grown in fully, but there was dignity in the silver. My skin was lined and my eyes tired, but the woman staring back had survived something, and not just the flu. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the lottery ticket. The paper was creased from where I had kept folding and unfolding it during the night. I hadn't planned to check it yet, but something in me was curious now. Not hopeful, just ready. I found a penny on the nightstand and scratched away the silver film. 3 numbers appeared. 8508 50850. I stared at them, unsure what they meant. $850 would have been more than enough. Enough to breathe for a while. Enough to rent a room somewhere. To buy shoes that didn't cut into my ankles. When I brought it downstairs and showed it to Nora, she paused mid-motion behind the counter. She looked at the ticket, then at me. Her eyes widened just slightly, and she whispered more than said, "You need to sit down." I did. She pulled a chair out for me, placed a glass of water in my hand before I could ask for it. Then she said it. "You just won $850,000. My mind didn't register it right away. She repeated the number. I tried to say something, but my mouth moved slower than my thoughts. I didn't shout, didn't laugh. I just sat there, like someone who had heard her name called after a long silence and wasn't sure whether to answer. I remember nodding. Nora said something about her nephew working at a bank, about taxes and documentation, about not telling anyone yet. I nodded again. That afternoon, I stayed in the cafe, helping her where I could. She handed me an apron and said nothing about my shaking hands. I poured coffee. I wiped tables. I sliced banana bread. People came and went. No one knew that the woman behind the counter had just climbed out of poverty in a single breath. But more than the money, what stayed with me was the stillness. No one demanding explanations. No one reminding me of what I owed them. In that small cafe, I was just a person, not a burden, not a tool, not a woman who'd worn herself down being useful. Later that day, when Nora's nephew came to speak with me, we went upstairs to the apartment. He wore a plain gray suit and spoke kindly, like someone used to explaining things slowly. He asked if I had identification. I told him it was still in Vanessa's house. He said we could request duplicates. He laid out a plan, how to protect the money, how to set up accounts, how to avoid people who'd want a piece of it. I listened, but what I kept thinking about wasn't investment portfolios or bonds. I kept thinking about a conversation that never happened, one I used to imagine on nights when I couldn't sleep, the one where Vanessa would sit with me and say, "I see how tired you are, Mom. I'm sorry I never made room for you to rest." It had always stayed just that, a fantasy. I stopped waiting for it the night she gave me $7 and told me to leave. After the nephew left, I went for a walk around the block. The town looked unchanged. Same parked cars, same blinking signs, same dogs barking at nothing, but something in the air felt new. Not brighter, not louder, just wider. As if the walls around me had been pushed back a little. I passed a real estate office with listings taped to the window. Small bungalows, one-bedroom cottages, nothing too grand, but homes, not guest rooms, not borrowed corners. I didn't go inside, I just stood there for a while, looking. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. She didn't look rich, she didn't look lucky, but she looked like someone finally walking in her own direction. When I got back to the cafe, Nora was cleaning up. She asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes. We sat across from each other at the same counter where I'd first walked in, holding my suitcase like a question. Now it sat beside me again, but I saw it differently, not as proof of what I'd lost, just a container for what I chose to carry. That night, I unpacked. For the first time, I folded my clothes into drawers instead of leaving them curled in a corner. I placed Howard's picture on the nightstand again. Then I opened the suitcase fully, pulled out the small box of jewelry, nothing valuable, just a few trinkets from earlier years, and set it on the dresser. I was still sick. I was still tired. But I felt a shift, as if the story I'd been told about myself, that I was done, used up, fortunate just to be housed, was no longer one I believed. I had one suitcase. I had one winning ticket. And I had time now. Time to learn what it meant to want something for myself, even if I had no idea where to start. I didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks. Nora knew, and her nephew knew, but beyond that, the world kept turning as if I were still the same woman who walked into the cafe half frozen and carrying everything she owned in one hand. I stayed in that room above the cafe, paid no rent, but bought groceries, swept the floors, kept the books for Nora while she focused on baking. She never asked me to. I just saw the gaps and stepped into them, like I always had. The difference was, this time, I could leave the gaps unfilled if I chose. That was the part I kept testing. What would happen if I didn't explain myself? And the world didn't collapse. It just adjusted. The money didn't make noise. It didn't demand attention or wrap me in gold. It just waited, patient and quiet, while I figured out what I wanted. I opened a savings account. I bought a new winter coat and a pair of sturdy walking shoes that didn't bite into my skin. I picked out a journal from the bookstore down the street, not to write in, at least not yet, but just to own something blank, something that could be anything. One morning, I woke before dawn and went walking. The streets were hushed, like they hadn't fully decided to wake up. I liked that hour, the honesty of it. No one performing, no one watching. I passed a shuttered florist, a laundromat with its lights still off, and a community center with a bulletin board filled with curling flyers. One of them caught my eye. It was for a photography class. Wednesdays at 10, beginners welcome, bring what you have. I didn't own a camera, but I tore the tab with the instructor's number anyway. Howard used to carry a camera with him everywhere. After he died, I boxed it up and left it in the back of the closet. Vanessa never showed interest, so I assumed it was still there. But that was another life, another house. I didn't call the number right away. I walked home, brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table in Nora's apartment, and stared at the paper scrap for almost an hour. I wasn't afraid of the class. I was afraid of wanting something again, of putting my hands on something fragile and having it taken. But I made the call. The man on the other end had a warm voice and a laugh that lingered between words. He told me to come by next week. Just show up, he said. You'll figure out the rest when you're here. The next Wednesday, I borrowed Nora's old point and shoot from a drawer in her linen closet. She didn't ask why, just handed me a bag of oatmeal cookies and said, "Be home for dinner." The classroom was in the basement of the library. 10 folding chairs, a projector, a blackboard with crooked chalk lines. The instructor was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with laugh lines and a shirt that didn't quite fit. He introduced himself as Eli and asked everyone to go around and share why they came. When it was my turn, I didn't say much. I used to watch my husband take photos. I thought maybe I'd like to see what he saw. Eli didn't press for more. He just smiled and moved on. That first session, we talked about light, how it bends, how it changes depending on what you're willing to wait for. He showed examples of shadows that spoke louder than faces. I felt something stir, not like fire, more like a flicker of warmth returning to fingers that had gone numb. After class, I walked around town, camera in hand, not taking pictures yet, just noticing. The chipped paint on the library railing, the way puddles mirrored brick buildings like they remembered another time. The world didn't look different, but I did. Or maybe I was just finally seeing it without the noise of being needed. That night, I sat in bed and thought about Vanessa. I didn't think of the betrayal or the cold hallway or the sound the door made when she closed it behind me. I thought about the silence since, the absence of her voice, her name, her chaos, and how, for the first time in years, I didn't miss it. The silence that money bought me wasn't luxury, it wasn't power, it was the right to be nobody for a while. And in that nothingness, I could finally hear myself again. There was something steady about the weeks that followed. I moved through them without needing to prove I existed. Mornings were for long walks, afternoons for cafe shifts, and Wednesdays for photography. Eli's class grew into something more than instruction. It became a place where time slowed, where we all looked closer, noticed details no one bothered to name. A crack in the sidewalk that ran like a river. A window that reflected sunset better than the sky. I took pictures, hundreds of them, of hands pouring coffee, of steam against glass, of Nora reading on her break with the light hitting her hair just so. I printed them quietly and pinned them to the wall above the desk in my room. I didn't show anyone. It felt like building a map only I could read, where each frame was a place I had passed through and survived. One afternoon, Eli stayed behind after class and asked if I'd ever shown my work. I shook my head. He said he was curating a small exhibit for the town library. Local artists, no pressure, just a table and a wall. He asked if I'd consider submitting. I said I'd think about it. At home that night, I looked over my photos again. Not all of them were good. Some were off-center, others too dark or soft. But some had breath in them, the kind of breath that comes from waiting long enough to see what others miss. I chose 5, printed them carefully, gave them to Eli the next week, unsure why my hands trembled when I did. The exhibit was 2 Saturdays later. Nora came with me. She wore her church coat and a lipstick she rarely used. The library cleared a room for it, and people filtered in slowly, neighbors, students, a few bored teenagers. My work was on the far wall. No name, just untitled series. I stood across the room, watching people stop in front of the prints. They leaned in. They tilted their heads. One woman even touched her chest softly, like something had stirred beneath the ribs. I didn't want praise. I just wanted the silence to shift a little, to confirm I hadn't disappeared. And for the first time in a long while, I felt witnessed in a way that didn't cost me anything. The next day, someone shared a photo from the exhibit on a local Facebook group. One of my prints, an elderly man reading a newspaper beneath a tree, had caught attention. Comments began to appear. Words like tender, unexpected, reminds me of my father. Someone asked who took the photo. Eli replied, a student of mine. Quiet, talented. She sees what most people pass by. Vanessa messaged me 2 days later. The name on the phone screen stopped me cold. She hadn't written since that night. I stared at it until the screen went dark. Then I opened it. Her message was short. I saw the post. Is that you? Mom? I didn't answer. Not that day. Not the one after. She sent another. I didn't know you took photos. They're beautiful. I read it twice, then put the phone down, walked to the cafe, washed cups, refilled sugar jars, let the ordinary hold me steady, because I knew what she was doing. Vanessa had spent months pretending I didn't exist. Now the world had whispered otherwise, and she'd heard it. The problem wasn't that she wanted to reach out. It was that she hadn't done it when I was invisible. She wanted the version of me that strangers admired, the one they called talented and warm. She hadn't made space for the one who folded laundry, who wiped spilled cereal from her children's shirts, who got sick quietly and asked for nothing. Recognition from the world didn't undo the forgetting. It just exposed it. I didn't block her. I didn't respond either. I let the message stay there, unanswered, a digital echo of what had already happened in real life. That night, I walked past the library again. The windows were dark, but my photos still hung inside. I stood there for a long time, not looking at the prints, but at my reflection, doubled by the glass. The woman looking back had lived through the vanishing, and now she was being remembered, but not for what she gave, for what she saw. Vanessa didn't stop with the messages. They came every few days, each one a little longer, a little softer in tone. She said she'd been thinking about me, that she hadn't realized how much she missed our conversations, that the kids had asked about their grandmother. I read every word, not because I was tempted, but because I was finally able to read them without feeling pulled. For years, I had been the one knocking, asking for time, asking for space to exist as something more than background noise in her life. Now the roles had shifted, and I saw it clearly. She didn't know who I was anymore. Not really. The person she discarded wasn't the one now taking photographs or pouring coffee or eating dinner without a clock ticking in the back of her mind. The woman she tried to contact was someone new. And that woman wasn't waiting by the door. One Saturday morning, Nora left a flyer on the kitchen table. New works by local artists, it read. My name wasn't on it, just a list of pieces and a time. I stared at it while I sipped tea. It felt strange, seeing evidence of myself in the world again. My work had been chosen for a small traveling exhibit around the county, not because it was groundbreaking, but because someone had seen something in it worth sharing. That was enough. That same day, Vanessa called. Not a message this time, an actual call. The phone lit up while I was wiping the cafe counter. I let it ring, then ring again. When it finally went silent, I placed it face down beside the register. Later, she sent another message. Please, Mom, can we just talk? But the thing she didn't understand was that we already had. That silence between us, those weeks, those months, that was the conversation. That was the answer she kept hoping to rewrite. A few days later, Nora mentioned someone had come by asking for me. A woman, mid-30s, well-dressed, tight smile. She said she was your daughter, Nora said carefully. I didn't ask what she told her. I already knew Nora well enough to trust that she hadn't given anything away. That evening, I walked through town again. The light had a certain slant to it, autumn creeping in. There was a chill now that made the air feel more honest. I sat on the bench near the square, the same place where I'd once eaten a sandwich alone, and wondered what would happen next. Now, I didn't wonder. It was never really about the money, or the photos, or the recognition. It was about what the absence had revealed. When Vanessa asked me to leave, she thought she was clearing space in her life. What she didn't see was that the absence would echo longer than she imagined, that it would grow teeth and memory and shape. She wanted back in, but there was no longer a back, no door I was holding open, no version of me still waiting in that kitchen chair, hoping to be asked to stay. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel angry, just still, like someone who had walked through a storm and found herself not in ruins, but in a clearing. Vanessa had her story, the one where I was too much, too sick, too inconvenient. She'd built her life on that version. Now she was trying to reach for something that didn't fit the narrative she'd chosen. But I didn't owe her a rewrite. The life I had now wasn't grand, it wasn't public, but it was real and quiet, and it belonged to me. And some doors, once closed gently, are better left untouched, not out of punishment, but out of peace. I didn't hear about the gala until days after it ended. Nora mentioned it offhandedly while we were restocking the pastry case, her tone curious but cautious. She said a man came into the cafe asking if I was Fidelia Harper, the photographer. I told her I didn't recognize the name, but it was mine. She handed me a crumpled flyer someone had left on the counter, a community charity gala for youth arts hosted at the university. They showed your photo, she said, the one of the boy with the violin case. I blinked at the paper. That photo had been part of the library exhibit. Eli must have submitted it to the gala's open call. It wasn't signed with my name, just a title, After Practice. I remembered the moment I took it. Late afternoon, soft light, the boy walking alone, his case nearly as big as him. His posture held that mix of exhaustion and purpose you only see in children trying to be good for someone. I hadn't thought much about it after printing. I certainly hadn't imagined it traveling beyond the town library wall, but what caught my attention wasn't the gala or the photo. It was what Nora said next. The woman presenting it, she said the artist had passed, that the photo was discovered posthumously. People were crying. I set the coffee pot down too hard. What woman? She didn't give a name, Nora said slowly, but she was tall, dark coat, spoke with a tone like she knew you very well. The room went quiet when she said your name. I didn't need more details. Vanessa always had a flair for storytelling. She knew how to shape absence into drama, how to polish silence until it gleamed. It made sense. Her building a version of me that no longer existed, not because she mourned, but because it served the image she needed. A mother who died quietly, far away, offering no mess to clean up, no consequences to answer. The strange thing was how little I felt. No heat, no outrage, just a quiet understanding of who she had always been. She hadn't just erased me from her life. She'd filled in the blank space with a lie that made her look kind, tragic even. A daughter who had lost her mother, rather than one who had told her to leave with $7 and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That weekend, I walked into Eli's studio. He was hanging new work, his hands smudged with charcoal. I asked him if he'd submitted my photo to the gala. He nodded, surprised I knew. They loved it, he said. There was this woman. She told a story about you. I assumed it was someone close. I didn't correct him, just asked if he had a copy of the event program. He handed it to me. On the back page was a photo of the room. I could see the crowd, the podium, the photo projected above. And there, off to the side, was Vanessa. Hair pulled back, pearls at her neck, hands clasped like she'd been praying. a look of composed grief. I folded the paper and placed it in my coat, walked home, sat on the balcony with the cold air pressing in, and stared out at the bare trees. She had buried me because it was convenient, because a dead mother can't ask questions, can't remind anyone what really happened. But the photo she used, the image that drew tears, had nothing to do with her. It was mine, my eye, my patience, my return to seeing the world after being forced out of it. I thought of the boy with the violin case. He had looked so alone that day, and yet, even in that loneliness, there was direction in his steps. I had captured him mid-stride, mid-becoming, and somehow that had survived, that had made its way into a room full of strangers and left them moved. Let her have her performance. Let them believe what they need to believe. I was still here, and I no longer needed to be known by those who only remembered me when it made them look generous. The knock on the cafe door came 15 minutes after closing. I was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, half listening to Nora hum something off-key near the back. I almost didn't answer, but something about the way it sounded, firm but measured, made me pause. I dried my hands and opened the door a crack. He looked older than I remembered. The lines on his face had deepened, the hair at his temples gone fully gray, but it was his eyes that held me in place. They weren't tired. They were searching. "Fidelia," he said. My name sat oddly on his tongue, like it hadn't been spoken in a long time. "Do you have a minute?" I stepped aside without replying, motioned him in. Nora caught sight of him from the kitchen and raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. I poured a small cup of whatever was left in the pot and slid it toward him. He sat carefully, as if unsure what kind of space he was entering. "I saw the photo at the gala," he said, after a long pause. "I didn't believe it at first, that it was yours, that you were gone." I said nothing. He looked down at his hands, folded tight around the cup. "Then I saw your name on the artist sheet, in small print. You were there all along. But Meredith, she stood on that stage like—" He stopped himself. "I didn't ask her to," I said evenly. "I know," he answered, eyes flicking up to mine. "That's why I came." I waited. "She's been unraveling," he said. "It started slow. The stories, the contradictions. One day, she said, you passed peacefully. Another, that you had a long illness and didn't want anyone to know. She told the kids you were some distant aunt. They didn't understand. And when your photo started showing up, when your name came back into the open, things began slipping." Still, I said nothing. He took a sip, winced slightly. The coffee had grown cold. "I didn't come to apologize for her," he said, voice lower. "I came because I wanted to see you, to see for myself what she erased." He looked around the cafe, at the walls with their uneven art, the shelves with mismatched mugs, the small chalkboard where Nora wrote the soup of the day in cursive loops. "You built something," he said, "without her, without any of us." I nodded once. That was all it needed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "This is from the kids, drawings mostly. They've been asking more questions lately, about where you are, why they do not see you anymore. I thought you should have these, whether or not you respond." He didn't linger, left the envelope on the counter, thanked me softly, and stepped back into the cold. I watched through the window as he crossed the street, his figure shrinking into the dusk. That night, I sat at the table in my apartment, the drawings spread before me, a sun with too many rays, a stick figure with gray hair and bright green shoes, a note in large, wobbly letters. "I hope you're not sick anymore." I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. The ache wasn't sharp. It was wide, like a field left untended, quiet and stretching far. What she had broken still left traces. in the hands of her children, in the way her husband looked for truth outside her words. She told everyone I had vanished, that I was a name to be grieved and moved past. But the world, in its quiet way, kept circling back, not for spectacle, just for presence, and sometimes presence was enough. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of afternoon where everything moves slow, where the air feels full of pause. I had just finished watering the balcony plants and was making soup, letting the broth hum low while the wind tapped at the windows. I didn't expect the knock. It came hard, twice, then once more, softer, like whoever stood outside wasn't sure they should be there. I didn't move. The hallway in front of the door stayed quiet for a few seconds, then filled with shuffling. Another knock, this time followed by my name. "Mom?" She said it like it still belonged to her. I turned the heat down on the stove, sat at the small table where I read most mornings. I could hear her breathing just beyond the door, a quiet rustle, then a paper sliding underneath. She didn't stay long, a minute, maybe two. Then the steps retreated, careful at first, then quicker. I waited a while before unfolding the paper. It wasn't long, just a few lines, handwritten, careful. "I saw your picture again. I know you're alive. I don't know what that means anymore. I just want to talk, please." There was no name at the end, just space. I folded the paper again, set it inside the drawer with the others, old receipts, clipped recipes, and bits of mail I didn't know what to do with but couldn't throw away. I didn't feel anger. That had dried up long ago. What stayed was something quieter, a line I had drawn without announcing it, without drama or declaration, just a shift, a lock turned, not to trap but to close. The next day, I called the landlord, asked for a new lock set, paid for it myself. The man who came to replace it was quick and quiet. He didn't ask why, just nodded and got to work. When he finished, he handed me 2 identical keys. I held them in my palm for a moment, their weight simple but clear. That evening, Nora asked if I wanted to join her for dinner at the bookstore cafe. I said yes. We walked there just before sunset, the air already folding into cool shadows. We didn't talk about anything important. She told me about a new delivery of misprinted mugs, and I told her the soup came out too salty. I noticed things more sharply now. The flicker of lights on storefront glass, the way people smiled with their whole face when no one was watching, the ordinary grace of choosing peace over repair. Some people saw forgiveness as an open door. I didn't. For me, forgiveness looked more like a quiet shift of weight, a changed key, a decision not to re-enter the room you once begged to be let into. I hadn't disappeared. I had simply redrawn the map, and the place where she thought she'd find me wasn't a home anymore. It was memory, a version of me that no longer waited to be claimed. There were still echoes, yes, a voice I'd carried since she was small, a longing that softened in the dark. But those things didn't mean I had to answer. They didn't obligate me to reopen what I had gently, finally closed. Sometimes love endures not in reunions, but in restraint, in letting the silence be enough, in recognizing that the most honest thing we can do for someone is leave them with the truth of their own choices. She knocked, and I didn't answer, not out of cruelty, but because peace had taught me to stay where I was. It was late autumn when the gallery curator asked if I'd consider contributing to a local exhibition. Portraits in Stillness, she called it, a collection of faces caught in the pause between thought and movement, between memory and forgetting. I hadn't planned to participate. My camera had rested untouched on the shelf for weeks. I'd been too wrapped in other kinds of living, kneading bread, pruning window plants, remembering what it felt like to have a body that belonged to no one's version of it. But the theme sat with me. I kept thinking of the girl in the alley behind the cafe. She came every Thursday, head down, waiting for her mother to finish the shift at the laundromat next door. One afternoon, I brought her a muffin and asked if she'd mind if I took a photo. She barely nodded, just kept looking at the cracked pavement, holding a small paper crane in both hands, like it might unravel if she moved. The photo stayed with me, not because it was beautiful, but because it was quiet, utterly, unshakably quiet. I submitted it with no title, just initials, a date, and a note that said, "No retouching." When the exhibit opened, I didn't attend the launch. I went a week later, alone, in the lull between lunch and dinner when most people were elsewhere. The room was hushed, the lighting gentle, and there she was, centered on the far wall. No filters, no frames gilded with meaning, just the softness of a child learning stillness, not by choice, but by necessity. A woman beside me whispered, "There's something about it, like she's not waiting to be seen, but already knows she won't be." I stood there for a long time, longer than I meant to. That photo didn't spark anything loud. There were no articles, no viral headlines, just one gallery request, then another, a message from an arts magazine asking for a feature, a quiet momentum, like ripples spreading from something dropped gently into water. And still, I didn't write my name in full. I kept the initials, let the work speak without context. People read into it what they needed. Some called it sorrow, some resilience, some grace. One evening, Nora called me to the front of the cafe. She had a copy of the magazine in her hands, open to the page with the photo. "A customer left this," she said. "Thought you'd want to see." Tucked inside was a note, not from Meredith, but from someone else, a former neighbor. It simply read, "Saw this and knew it was yours. The world's catching on, huh? Proud of you." I smiled, folded the paper, and slid it into my coat. I wasn't chasing recognition. I wasn't building a name to wave at anyone, but something about being known in pieces, by strangers who saw the quiet and stayed anyway, felt more honest than all the years I spent performing for people who called it love. That portrait changed nothing at home. Meredith never reached again. Her silence became steady, practiced, like she'd finally accepted what I had accepted long before her, that we'd come to a place where love no longer required proximity. But the photo changed something else. It made me visible, not for who I was to anyone, but for what I saw. That, I realized, was the difference between being used and being witnessed. I live in a house with creaky floors and windows that hum when the wind passes through. There's a cat that sleeps on my porch like it belongs to me, and maybe it does. The walls are pale green, the kind that softens morning light. The kitchen is small, but knows my rhythm. I keep one chair by the window, angled just right to catch the sun before noon. On that chair, most days, I sit and write letters I never send. Some begin with, "Dear Meredith." Others don't begin at all. I never wrote her back. Not after the note slid under my door. Not after the envelope of drawings from her children. I read them, yes. I even smiled at the crooked hearts and misspelled hopes. But I never folded myself back into that shape again. I learned that love doesn't always survive contact. Sometimes it holds its truest form only from a distance. A shape in memory, tender and unfinished. Nora tells me I should teach a class, photography maybe, or visual storytelling. The thought used to make me uneasy. Me, standing in front of a room offering something. But now I think I might. Not for applause, just for the quiet joy of showing someone how to see differently. Last week, I took a trip with no real destination. Just boarded a train with a notebook and a scarf and let the motion carry me. I watched towns blur into each other, watched strangers nod off against the glass. There was a man across the aisle reading a book about grief. He didn't cry, but I could feel it in the way he held the pages, gentle, like they might fall apart if he turned too fast. I understood that. When the train stopped at a small coastal town, I stepped off. No reservations, just followed the smell of salt and the sound of gulls. I stayed 2 nights in a bed and breakfast run by a woman who had a laugh like a hymn. She didn't ask what brought me there. She just handed me the room key and said, "Sometimes we arrive because we've already left." I'm not sure I ever returned to the version of myself who once begged for belonging. I think she faded somewhere between the thrift store counter and the first cup of cafe tea. And in her place, someone else grew. Not harder, not colder, just quieter, more rooted. I still think of my daughter, some days more than others. I wonder if she ever tells the truth now, or if she still weaves versions of people that suit the rooms she wants to stand in. I wonder if her children ask why their drawings went unanswered. But I don't wonder what could have been. That story ended, not with confrontation or forgiveness, just with clarity. I didn't rebuild a relationship. I rebuilt a life, a rhythm, a space where I belonged to myself. And when I walk now, through markets, down quiet streets, along gallery halls, I don't brace for recognition. I don't hope to be seen. But when I am, I know it's for who I became, not for who I once tried to be for someone else. That, I've learned, is the truest kind of revenge.